For our event here in the ENTSO-E building in Brussels. Also, good morning to all of you joining us online for today's session on delivering the European offshore electricity system. We're quite excited for having this event today with all of you showing up in large numbers. As you know, offshore has always been a topic of ENTSO-E to work on somewhere in the package and everything we're doing on system planning, on network codes and discussion papers. But in recent years, offshore really has become like a front and center topic for the work of ENTSO-E, and the enthusiasm is, of course, not getting any less these days. I think that's an understatement to start with, of course. At least we're very happy with the large interest we saw from all of you joining for today's event. I'm very much aware that if you're interested in offshore energy, you can look at your calendar and take an event every day for the past few months and for a couple of following months to join an event on offshore energy somewhere in Europe. So it was a bit of the challenge up to us to ENTSO-E to make an event which is relevant and rewarding for all of you to join. So we're very happy with the agenda we have to offer for you, all of you today. We have three building blocks we want to take you through today. At least we want to kickstart our event today with having a view at some of the discussion papers ENTSO-E has developed a few years ago. Let's take stock of what we thought during that process a few years ago. Have they survived the test of time? They were written at the time when we didn't have Repower EU, we didn't have a Net Zero Industrial Act, and so on, of course. So very happy to reflect again on those discussion papers, the conclusions, and very much looking forward to the questions and comments any of you have on this topic. In the second session with today, we want to dive a bit deeper into actual system planning. We just delivered our T1EP 2022, and the team is already working hard with all our TSO members on T1EP 2024. And in the stream of that, we also have our first offshore network development plans being developed. We've been somehow breaking the ice in various bilateral discussions with stakeholders, with member states, with commission. And I think this is the real actual ENTSO-E event where we want to disseminate to all of you what is the plan behind the offshore network development plans, what it's all about. And again, very much appreciate questions and thoughts any of you have on the work going forward. And then in the session afternoon, at least with the people here present in Brussels today, we want to have a few roundtable discussions to talk a bit further about which topics you believe are important to enabling an offshore electricity system across Europe, which topics deserve further attention, where do we need more thought leadership, what do you believe ENTSO-E should take up as priority for developing further discussion papers, and which kind of recommendations do all of you have. So it's these three blocks we have in mind for today's agenda. I am happy it sparked some interest and very much looking forward to discussion with all of you here today. I know I'm a bit preaching to the converted here because you all signed up already. You made the effort to come to Brussels. But again, a warm thanks for all of you and very much looking forward to a successful event here with all of you today. My name is Edwin Hazen. I'm head of system development here at ENTSO-E. It's my pleasure to introduce all the speakers, all the guests, all the moderators during today's event. The moderators will give further guidance about how the sessions will be organized. At least you see on the screen here now, at least we have a Slido interface for any kind of interaction you want to have with the panelists, with the moderators, questions you want to ask, observations you want to give. Please, I encourage you to already log into Slido and to enter your comments and ideas during the discussions so the moderators can pick them up during the sessions we have in the two building blocks before lunch. Also for the people in the room, you can engage via Slido. You can do it via raise of hands. At least if you have an interest, you want to raise something, we'll make sure it gets picked up. Just a few formalities, of course. For those people here physically in Brussels, please turn off your cell phones. We're not following a webinar, of course, remotely from home. So thanks for your attention on this one. The session will be recorded, so if you want to take a look at it afterwards, share it with colleagues, you can of course do so, of course. And also all the material being presented, what you see on the screen here, will be made available on our website in due time. For the people joining us remotely, as said, you're muted by default, but if you want to engage, if you have questions, please engage via the Slido app. Many thanks for that. I'll keep it at this for the introduction. Again, I wish you all a very successful event, and I'm very happy to pass on the word now to Mr. Gerald Kendler, Chair of our System Development Committee at ENTSO-E, to share some opening thoughts for today's event. Gerald, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Edwin, and on behalf of ENTSO-E, a warm welcome first to the online audience from Europe and maybe even some abroad worldwide, because those offshore events also find interest worldwide. And a very warm welcome to you. It's really great after those 3 years to be in a room together to discuss. It's really, really great. And the first thing, I mean, if you think about the energy transition, it is about efficiency and it is about electrification. And for electrification, we need a lot of renewable energy. And renewable energy, of course, we have the onshore event. You know, the commission said we are going to have 300 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2050, and that does not include UK. This comes on top. So we're talking about major numbers. And back then, when we heard the numbers for the first time, we thought, what is needed? First, it is not sufficient just to connect the wind, but you have to bring it to the load centers and you have to integrate it into the system. Then this whole thing is going to be very expensive. Of course, the offshore generation is expensive, but also the infrastructure is expensive. Because it's expensive, it makes good sense to make good use of it. So can we also use it to interconnect countries, not only connect the offshore, but to interconnect countries? And what does this mean? What does this mean concerning regulatory issues? What does this mean concerning our setup? And then building this amount of infrastructure also means you need lots of resources. Space is scarce. You think the oceans are big. No, when you find the gates to come on land, you see it's really small. And also, you know, everyone who lived through COVID knows how difficult it is to get the right equipment. And also people can plan things and who can actually build the infrastructure, and everything required is a big challenge. So there's a huge challenges, and the first thing that we did is we have to sort this. And actually, the person who really pushed for this and who led the first team was Antje. And she said, we need answers. We need to discuss this. And so we did this. And this is how our first 6 position papers came out, because we wanted to share our thoughts that we had. And today we are presenting them to you. Actually, here, maybe Antje, she was leading the team who did the first 6 position papers. And now this is being taken over by Bent and Bojana, who you will see later during the day. And Antje is now in charge of the offshore network development plans. So those are the things we will be talking about. Anyhow, coming back. And when we looked at at offshore, we had a few key findings that I would like to share here first, before we go into details. And one key finding is that the principal setup really is quite good that we have. So the roads that we have, the regulatory framework is in principle good, but it needs to be enhanced here and there. Why? Because of the high costs involved, of the risk involved, and of the scarcity issues, and of course of the new setup with this dual use that we didn't see like this before. So we are on a good track, but things need to improve. And at the same time, the Commission said, oh, we know what we should do or what we could do. We are going to update the 10E regulation, and we will request ENTSOE to do the offshore network development plans, to say what infrastructure is going to be needed 2030, 2040, 2050, and please do it within the T1DP background, so you really make sure that the energy gets delivered to the end customer. And here I would like to quote Antje first, her favorite saying, she's knowing what's saying, we have to plan across time, space, and sectors to bring offshore renewable energy to the end user. And this is really to plan across time, space, and sectors. And this is really a great challenge that we are happy to take on. So this is what we are going to be talking about to set a little bit the scene. And if we could have the agenda of today, we will start with Antje presenting the 6 position papers, just a high-level view on them. And then we have, of course, our natural partner, Wind Europe, Vasiliki, is going to be on the panel and present her views. We have Antonella from Renewables Grid Initiative to be on the panel and present her views. I mean, for Wind Europe, it's natural, and Antonella we just need, because she always brings a new perspective, new views that we would really brighten the day and that we would really miss without hearing them. And we have a coffee break, and from this we go to the more policy side, the more planning side. As Edwin said, we have an introduction by Joachim Balke, European Commission, and then we explain the TYNDP. This is done by Rodrigo. It is unfortunately Patricia, who is the convener of the TYNDP, could not make it today. So Rodrigo, who is the response manager at ENTSO-E, is going to do it. Just want to point out that the whole European grid planning is done in the hand of very capable ladies. So Antje, Patricia, Bente, and Bojana. And then we are going to see the ONDPs again presented by Antje, and a very quick conclusion from me at the end of the session. And in the afternoon, we are going to have 4 breakout sessions, and then the day is going to conclude. So this is the day for today. I hope it's going to be very interesting. I'm really looking forward about the interaction because it's really important on this big journey to talk to you, to get your views. We're very much looking forward to this. And I pass on the word back to Edwin.
For setting the scene here. Our first speaker doesn't need an introduction because you introduced Antje several times very well, of course. It still says Energinet behind your name on the agenda, even though you've been part of the ENTSO-E family for more than 10 years. You already are fully embedded here in the organization, of course. Gerald mentioned a few interesting themes already in his introduction. He spoke about ambition and scaling up, of course, as well as about scarcity in the system. So we very much look forward to hearing from you, Antje, about the views we collected within ENTSO-E in the past years, which culminated in a few discussion papers. Thanks for sharing your thoughts, refreshing our minds, and triggering the discussion with the other panelists later on. I pass on to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you both Edwin and Gerald for starting this up. So also from my side, very warm welcome to everyone who is here and also to everyone being online. Yes, you heard that we wrote the 6 position papers, and we did this actually in the Corona years. So there was not so much else to do than work, and so this was a very efficient period from ENTSO-E side. So we produced with 6 very good teams. We produced these 6 papers. I will focus today on some of them because some are linked, and so that it's better to focus on the later one than on the first. Yeah, give a short overview. Actually, the first one, top left, is the very general. We started this also to find out if we have same thinking, where we are, if we see the same challenges or not. And this was a very smooth process actually, because yeah, we just stated the obvious. But that's a good start. And later on, actually, some of the topics which we identified in this first paper got their own paper afterwards, because we saw the need to deep dive into some extra issues. So then the second paper, which is market and regulatory issues, top right, was paper number 2. There we investigated 2 market design principles, which was home market versus bidding zone, and assess this against efficiency related to market design and to system operation efficiency. In the meantime, it's a kind of common sense in Europe that the offshore bidding zone is the way forward, because it reflects best the physics in the market as well. And an update of this is then paper 5, bottom left, where we go into financing issues. And this will be one of today's focus points. Paper 3 was interoperability. This was based on joint cooperation with T&D Europe in the RDIC committee. And so we could grab their findings from intense collaboration between T&D Europe and ENTSO-E and formulate some issues on interoperability. So it's about that it must be possible that assets from different manufacturers work together. And what was missing was some field where we could test and demonstrate. And based on this, actually, now some research projects have been started and are ongoing, looking jointly into how we can get there, so that the assets from different manufacturers do work together. Paper 4 then was on, did investigate it was a systematic assessment of system definitions and system operational tasks. And there we looked into definitions and task and looked what is the issue, and then looked where is it in which regulation or which guidelines is that addressed. is this good enough or not? And so we did a very systematic assessment. And the outcome was, yes, the rules and regulation as they are today, they work, and we can use them also offshore, because we use them already onshore, of course, but they we can work with them and start getting on offshore. So no need to change the rules, because always changing the rules implies several years of work of politicians and or technicians, and we don't have the time to work on paper, but we need to build things. Yeah, then actually I could. How do I change the slide? By just saying it. Okay. Now you see, I put it in my pocket, and now everyone can help me when I look for it. Okay. The basic for everything we did is all these paper focus on these offshore hybrid projects. And what is that? This is what we call, it's based on dual purpose. So the one purpose, as Gerald said already, is connect offshore to shore. And the second purpose is to connect countries or bidding zones. If we then talk about multi-purpose, we mean with it also crossing sectors. And then we come to this space, time, and sectors. And we only look at infrastructure only. So because one of the basic principles in Europe is from the internal energy market is the unbundling principle. Generation and transmission are separate things. And therefore, we only look at infrastructure in everything we do. And this is the starting point, the point of departure in all our discussions we had. So this is maybe important to say before we dive into the topics. You can see here some indication what belongs to it and what not. Sometimes you see the only red line on this is from generation to the first hub. This is treated differently in several countries. Sometimes it's the developer having to build this, sometimes it's the TSO, so this can be subject to different rules. But all the other stuff, so between the offshore hubs, from offshore hub to shore, everything is the infrastructure which belongs to the offshore hybrid system, we think. Next slide. First paper was then looking at the basic challenges, which are costs, which is maritime spatial planning, environmental issues, system balancing, system security, and these topics we thought, of course, environmental protection, public acceptance, and all these topics, as I said, were afterwards partly investigated in a follow-up paper. So the 5 basic principles which we found there is that we need to think holistic. So we need to think about the whole system when building offshore. Actually, we see the European system between Finland and Portugal on and offshore is one big system. So that's the one system approach we have. And therefore, we also, when changing or building out elements, we always need to think about the whole system and how it works together. And this, we have the TYNDP, and so we have consistent planning across Europe. And this ensures that we can be on time with everything we do. We expect a modular and stepwise approach. As you always start simple and then build the assets on top of that. But we have the long-term perspective in our mind while doing so. And therefore, we enter the topic of anticipatory investments. So sometimes it might be necessary to build a bit bigger today because we know something is coming tomorrow. And there we need then help from regulators who have to allow that because it needs somehow to be financed. Interoperability, I said it already. So by ensuring that different manufacturers' assets work together and also different AC and DC and everything works together, we can then be faster and unlock the the smart integrated system. Also we can ensure smarter system operations. Our target is to keep the energy bills low as possible, but no compromise on quality. Paper 6 goes into these topics a bit. Yeah, the future-proof regulatory framework, it should be stable. So because everything unsettling the market means in the end higher prices, and this is what nobody wants. So, and we found across our papers that what we have, the regulatory framework we have, is more or less good enough so that we can focus on building stuff instead of focus on papers. Next. This is just a teaser because Antonella has to leave after this session, but Gerald introduced it already. So we have the task in ENTSO-E to prepare the offshore network development plan, which is a joint endeavor between member states who have to deliver the goals. Then it's us to deliver the infrastructure. Then the Commission comes with guidelines, put a price tag on it. So it's about guidance for sea basin, cost benefit, cost sharing. Then again, we have to take this method on board and put these price tags on the infrastructure, which we have developed before. And I'm very curious to hear, maybe Antonella has a recipe how to not harm the environment, or what we have to consider when integrating these gigantic 300 gigawatts into the sea basins. So which mistakes should we not do? So I'm very curious what Antonella has to tell us about this, how she can help. Otherwise, we have a dedicated session afterwards when she unfortunately has left, but we can continue discussions later today. Next. Yeah, this is one I announced that paper 5 will be in focus. This was a continuation of this bidding zone home market and financing topic. So in general, you see at the top line, or a different way. Today, we have the discussion about electricity market reform. And in that context, the idea was also brought up that the alignment between incentives for TSOs and wind generators or offshore might need to be done. And so therefore we thought about how could this be done and how are things financed. You see this at the top line. In general, transmission costs are financed, second line, by tariffs at the one hand and by congestion income on the other hand. While production, again, remember unbundling, production is financed by market revenues on the one hand and maybe state support on the other hand. So now in the course of this discussion on market reform and on, so the idea came up, well, these offshore wind generators or offshore RES face bigger risks when being connected to an offshore hybrid project compared to when they are connected just radially. When being connected radially, they know the risk, they can look into the future and they can think if they get their money back or not. When being connected to this offshore hybrid thing, this new kid on the block, they cannot really estimate how things look because they face certain risk, which is a price risk, which is the same as also radially connected offshore wind faces, and they face a volume risk. So because it could be that due to some congestions in the grid, the price collapses and then they cannot also sell their energy at a certain price. And so then the idea was, well, TSOs, they earn more in these hybrid projects because there are more congestions, and every time there's a congestion, this is then the energy is timed by the price, and this is then money for the TSO. There we looked into this. Is that right that TSOs earn more? And we found not really, or it's hard to predict, because now we will have we will use this advanced hybrid coupling. So we will go to flow-based calculations. And then it's not only the two ends of an interconnector, but the whole system. at both ends is considered when talking about the price somewhere in the system. And this is a very complex endeavor. And it's very complex to predict if anything, if the price really, or if there is congestion and what's the impact. And we did some calculations in ENTSO-E or some TSOs and found at one hand it's hard to predict, and the other hand it's not that many hours. So there is not that much extra income. Back to the question, should this congestion income then be given to the offshore res? So then we found maybe not, because it would violate the basic principle of unbundling. Because in general, yeah, so then we would cross subsidize, which is forbidden by some European rules, and we would violate the rules that the regulator sets the tariff, because then the regulator would indirectly or get some advice from the governments how to set the tariff. So this would not be separated. And in general, this would be an unfortunately mix of things. However, we acknowledge that the offshore res does see this risk, and they do need some support to be incentivized to go the way of offshore, connecting to offshore hybrid projects. We just found maybe congestion income is not the way forward, and their discussions today have evolved to transmission access guarantee, which means that if there's a strike price agreed in the tender, and if the price is below that strike price, they would be compensated by some state support. And this could be, we point in the direction of CFDs, contracts for difference, and the discussion is currently there. So we do acknowledge there is some support is needed, and we point currently in the direction of contracts for difference could be a way forward. But of course, you might imagine if the member state has to give some money or to support, they think about elections, and so they are also not that happy. So they like to push it to the TSOs, because then some invisible tariff would be increased. But TSOs think, we would violate the basic principle of the internal energy market. This is not a good idea. So that's where the discussions are today. Yeah, maybe now next slide. Otherwise, I talk too long. While working on paper 5, we discovered that the setups in different countries, who does what, these setups differ. And then we wanted to know what is actually a good setup, because we have this task to integrate this giant amount of 300 gigawatts without Great Britain. And how could we do this most efficiently, fastest, without violating any rules? And then we looked into the lifetime of projects, from network planning via asset design and building, ownership, maintenance, up to operation. And then we looked into each of these phases and thought, who could do this part? And so we found what you see in different lines, different delivery models. The onshore TSO, this is like it is today. We just expand our responsibility area to offshore as well. On offshore TSO, this is not each country has an own offshore TSO. No, this would be the same as the onshore TSO, but we thought offshore TSO, the definition would be all TSOs around a sea basin form a new entity and then go forward with all these steps. Competitive light is like it is, for example, in Great Britain. So we have, or also in Denmark, actually. So it's one of the possibilities that the asset design and building can be taken by a third party. So anyone is allowed, according to, and we have also some third-party projects in the T1EP. Everyone is allowed to design and build infrastructure, so that part could be done by a third party, and the rest again by the onshore TSO. Then a model we call it competitive is when that third party also owns, is responsible for ownership and maintenance. That's like the British system where they have OFTOs, the offshore transmission owners. And in general, we found ownership and maintenance cannot be separated because the one who owns has to ensure that the assets are available. And so then the maintenance planning should be done by that party. And the last is then competitive ISO. There we thought, what if an independent system operator would take over the operation? So that party would also need to collaborate with the onshore TSO already in the planning phase. So we had these 5 models and then thought, fine, and wanted to compare these models. Next slide. What we then did is now you have the models in the columns, but then we found how to compare this, and there we found different criteria, which also have sub-criteria, and then we wanted to compare for each and every of these criteria the models against each other, which is best, which is not as good, which is even better, and which is completely rubbish. And so we did this in a very systematic way with deep discussions. Again, it was big fun for us to have these expert discussions from different countries with a lot of input from all the colleagues. And actually, I think also this is worth reading. So we could spend a whole day on only this paper, but I'm sure you might wish to read it now. And I'm sure we also will have some of these aspects. We will discuss this later on during this day. I wish you a lot of fun, and we have to be bold now. We have to be fast, and we have to anyway not violate basic principles of environmental aspects, security of supply, and the basic rules of the markets. So I think I stop here, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Antje. Many thanks for an excellent overview. It wasn't an easy task given to you to summarize these years of thinking, culminating in 6 papers in only 15 minutes. But thanks for an excellent overview here, of course. I must assume it triggered some questions, of course, some reactions. Anyone who wants to react, please do connect via the Slido app. You again find the QR code here on the screen. For the sake of time, I suggest we continue the panel with our 2 next speakers, and still give opportunity for questions to Antje for all the work done by the ENTSO-E team on these 6 papers, then in our Q&A session later on. Also good to hear indeed, Antje, that everything you did during what you call dark COVID years 2 years ago, it remains relevant, for example, consistent income distribution in context of EMDR and so on. So that's all excellent to hear. We come back to all these points later on in a moment. Continuing with our session, it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Ms. Vasiliki Klonaris. Where is Vasiliki at the moment? There you are. I invite you to take place here with us here at the panel. Vasiliki is head of energy system integration at Wind Europe. Thanks for being part in this panel discussion, of course. We look forward to hearing from you, Vasiliki, about what your thoughts are on the need for speed for offshore deployment. I remember we were in a session on grid infrastructure 2-3 weeks ago, and you thought I'm going to be provocative and just challenge the entire audience by saying, infrastructure, it's great, but we're not getting there. Prove me that I'm wrong.
Sorry.
Vasiliki, prove yourself that statement was actually wrong. What can be done and should be done? I give you the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Edwin. So I have to use, no, I don't have to use it, right? No. Okay, good morning, everyone. And thank you very much for the introduction. My name is Vasiliki Klonari. I represent Wind Europe. It's a trade association of wind energy in Europe for the ones who don't know us. And I'm joining here today with Maria Kotoforu, who is somewhere sitting in the audience behind, I think. So first of all, I would like to thank you, Antje, Edwin, and in general, ENTSO-E, for all your work on offshore electricity. This is very important for us, and for organizing an event like this is a great opportunity to discuss. Of course, we've been in discussions all the time, but it's important to have it also in this context. Next slide, please. Yeah. So I would like to start with an overview of the current status of wind energy in Europe today. We have installed 30 gigawatts, which is 3%, covers 3% of Europe's electricity demand. You can see this with the dark blue bars on the map. With the light blue bars, you can see what are the targets. So based on latest announcements of the different countries, what are the targets for 2030? So including the UK and Norway, we expect 156 gigawatts. And if we exclude the UK and Norway, it's 103 for 2030, and at least 437 by 2050, again, if we consider the UK and Norway. So as you can see, 3% of one third of the offshore wind is actually going to be installed by 2030. And I will explain later why is this important to mention. Let's go please to the next slide. Here is another nice map where you can see all the offshore wind farms that are either online, already operational, or in the different status modes. So with the prevailing color is the dark blue, which means that these plants are actually planned for now, but at least we know where they will be, the capacity and everything. Yeah, let's move to the next slide, please. Yeah, why I mentioned before the 1/3. So in terms of grid integration, grid connection, as you know, we have, as Antje also mentioned, we have two ways today. We have the point-to-point or radial connections and the offshore hybrids. So based on what we expect in terms of deployment, most probably the 1/3 of the capacity will be connected as radial connections. So we really need to give our focus also on this part. Let me start with the offshore hybrids, which of course we see as a way to increase the efficiency of the grid, is a way to optimize the system, and of course also ways to minimize the environmental impact. So of course, it's a very important asset for us for the integration of offshore wind energy. It requires cross-border coordination on market and technical aspects since the very early planning stage, which of course makes things more difficult. And in our view, today, the regulatory framework is not adequate for a wind farm connected via an offshore hybrid to get a final investment decision for the assets to happen. And of course, we also, so this brings high uncertainty for the investor and of course the developer. For the point-to-point connections, things are a bit easier. We have gained some experience. There is more certainty for the investor, and decisions are actually made at national level, which can be both good and bad. It's easier to advance things, but then it's very important. Ideally, there should also be cross-border coordination for uniformity on connection charges or technical requirements. Next slide, please. Yeah, so today we have a number of offshore hybrids being planned, not really being planned. So most of them, you can see here on the map, the ones we are aware of. So most of them are actually in very early conception or just declaration of intent stage. And if all of this happen, then they will connect up to 40 gigawatts of wind by 2032, 2035. So we still have a big capacity that we need to see how it will be connected and find the best way. This is why this discussion today is so important, actually. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is actually, I tried to put it on a slide, the different needs or wish list of a wind farm developer, no matter if it is for an onshore wind farm, a radially connected offshore wind farm, or a wind farm connected via an offshore hybrid. Of course, for actually getting grid integrated into the grid and the market, first of all, a timely grid connection is very important. And this means that, of course, ideally, they should be protected by regulation in case of delays in the development of the grid. This could be also onshore delays in onshore grid reinforcement. But of course, it would be good if we can find some solutions to advance the situation with, for instance, temporary solutions like flexible connection contracts, which are discussed in the electricity market design proposal by the Commission. so subject to operational limitations, but only for a temporary period until the grid is reinforced. We have the volume risk, where of course we have the risk of wind forecasting, so how wind production will be based on the weather. This includes also the risk of not having maximized firm export capacity, and also the risk of curtailment. They also want to reduce the price risk, which means their ability to pay back the capex, the high capex investment for developing the asset at the beginning on estimated times for the investment, of course, and also the need to have a level playing field across national systems, both in terms of technical rules and yeah, charges and costs or yeah, markets. Next slide, please. Yeah, so for the radial connections, this translates into the need to have standardized ways to set charges, connection charges, technical requirements across the countries. And what I mentioned already before for the timely grid access. But also it's very important to make sure that incentives and rules for collocating offshore wind with other technologies should also be very clear to make sure that also these kind of assets can go ahead. Next slide, please. So in the case of wind farms connected via an offshore hybrid and bidding in an offshore bidding zone, the volume risk is a bit higher. The reason for this is that these wind farms are can be actually subject to limitations of their export capacity because of TSO actions trying to maintain the operability of the system. This is actually a specificity compared to other wind farms that are connected radially offshore or that are connected that are just onshore, because the capability of these wind farms to make revenues is solely and directly linked to their transmission access to the asset. Currently, we do not have any demand offshore. The grid is not meshed and will not be meshed for the next at least 15 years. So when we have this kind of limitations of the export capacity, which are actually explained in the study I have put in the source here and also defined as operational limitations, the wind farm loses expected revenues, and at the same time, the congestion income of the interconnector increase. Just two important things here, clarifications. Even if the 70% rule is applied perfectly by a TSO, this problem remains because this is not a market problem, but is an operational issue. So first is this point I would like to make. And the second is that this kind of risk is really difficult, is actually impossible for a wind farm developer to forecast it, which means that it cannot really be incorporated in his bid for a CFD. It cannot be part of a CFD. It may be partly, but for sure, this requires actually a compensation and not a state support because it cannot be incorporated in the bid and it cannot be predicted. And of course, many countries, as you might know, like Denmark or the Netherlands, do not plan to have state support, like two-sided CFDs. So for a wind farm developer to get a final investment decision for a wind farm connected to an offshore hybrid and bidding in an offshore bidding zone, this cannot happen if they are not compensated for these limitations of their export capacity. Next slide, please. Yeah. As Anke explained, 2 months ago, we had a proposal by the European Commission on market design, and relevant to this discussion, we think that there are 3 articles. So first of all is the Article 19 of the electricity regulation, which actually proposes that part of the congestion income of the interconnector is shared among the generator and the TSO. Of course, currently is fully owned by the TSO. So in this case, we support the proposal because we think, as I explained, that a compensation is needed for this kind of limitations in the export capacity. But we would like the Commission to be much more specific that this the amount that should be shared is actually just the higher revenues of the interconnector because of the connection of the farm. So not all the congestion rents, and this should be clear in the legislation. So the incremental revenue, which leads to higher market revenues for the wind farm. The second article that we see as very relevant is what was mentioned before, is Article 18, that is about anticipatory investments and the possibility for tariff methodologies to incorporate both CAPEX and OPEX. So we consider offshore hybrids as a way to optimize, to increase the efficiency of the grid. So could this be considered as a possibility that the OPEX for compensating operational these limitations of the wind farm are actually incorporated through through these investments? And then is Article 15 of the electricity regulation, or 31 of the electricity directive, which is about flexible connection contracts. The proposal gives this possibility for storage, but we think this should be also possible for generation, both at distribution and transmission level, but temporary until grid reinforcement takes place. Next slide, please. Here I have taken your graph, Antje. And I would like actually to reply to some of the questions, the comments that you made before. So first of all, what we say, and what based on the modeling that wind farm developers are doing, is that the congestion income will be higher. Maybe not too much higher, but for the next years, when we do not have any demand offshore and no mass grid, we expect that it will be higher because of the presence of the wind farms generating and releasing power in the interconnector. The state support do not have to be smaller, because does not have to be smaller, because actually the state support is designed to pay back the capex of an asset, and not this kind of limitations, which are, by the way, not compensated today. So we do not have any cross subsidy issue. The market revenues are less because of the limitations that I mentioned. So I had taken some more notes, and yeah, as I said, with today, this congestion income can be used either to reduce the tariff or to make investments in new grids. So let's find a common way to use this in building these assets, because an offshore wind farm developer will not get an investment decision if these limitations are not compensated. So in the end, you say generation is out of scope, but for us, generation is the scope. The vast majority of these assets will be built to connect wind. So let's find a common way to make sure that this happens, because otherwise, we can still try to not rock the boat of regulation for a while. But for us, what is more important is that this might violate the targets and for offshore wind deployment, and in general of decarbonization. So we have a big change of the regulation today. Many articles have been changed. This is not the only one. So it's a good opportunity to find a solution. Thank you for this, and let me know if you have any questions, please.
Thank you, Vasiliki. Thank you. Please take a seat. Join us for the rest of the panel discussion. Questions will come, rest assured. Question must come, of course, yeah. But as Antje said to start with, we can make all the plans we want. In the end, something has to be built, of course. So if there's any barrier for an investor to actually develop the assets, we have to listen to, of course, what possible options and solutions could be. Discussion to be continued. That being said, I pass on the word now for our next speaker in the session, Ms. Antonella Battaglini, who is CEO of the Renewable Grid Initiative, to share some thoughts about how to enable offshore electricity systems, how to overcome challenges, how to find solutions. Perhaps pick up the question which Antje already directed to you directly a moment ago. And please, Antonella, share your thoughts with us. I know you have to leave shortly after this session already, so please take the time you have now available to share inspiration and thoughts with all of us. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thanks for the invitation. So let me start from the end, actually. What you have seen here with this input is that the generation side need to collaborate much closer with the grid side. Because these, I would say, different opinions that are currently on the table actually are creating uncertainties for investors, uncertainties for politicians, and therefore will delay the deployment of offshore. So instead of fighting each other, just work together. It's a better approach. How you're going to do it, I don't know, but you have to find a solution because it is absolutely counterproductive to have the renewable community taking position against or partially against ENTSO-E and the grid operators while you need each other. So now I go back to my it's the stage of fine-tuning. And I can understand that. And probably here in the room, the people that are working on the topics, they see this as fine-tuning. But outside in the world, this is perceived as different mindsets, as competition, and essentially different directions. And this is not good because there are a huge amount of actors that are only keen to see you fail, both. So what is my recipe for a deployment of offshore? And I would like to, I don't have slides because slides I would have prepared a couple of days ago, and they would have not been good anymore after listening at these two speeches. So I'm going to refer to the dimensions that were mentioned by Antje and Gerald, time, space, sectors. And I would add a fourth one, communities. How do we deploy offshore wind in time, in the right space, in collaboration with sectors, and with respect to communities? Definitely, we need to build a lot of infrastructure. It's not just grid or generation, it's flexibility, it's a bit of everything. It's a huge amount of infrastructure that needs to be built quickly. But if you want to build quickly, you need to build well. Because if you don't build well, you will then probably be able to build 1, 2, maybe even 10 projects, but you will never be able to build the entire bulk of the infrastructure that we need. So build well and think that the world doesn't end in 2030, hopefully, because of course shit happens, it may well. And not even in 2040. It means that you will have to build much more going ahead unless we find a silver bullet that will remove the need of infrastructure. I'm actually reading a fantastic book where there is no need for grids because there is so much electricity that it is kind of Bluetoothed into your devices. But I think we are far away from that. So my recipe for the future is, number one, abandon the idea of the non-regret option, non-regret investment. We need to overbuild because we have not built enough for so long for a number of reasons. And what have we got? We got a need to keep alternatives. We have got very weak possibilities for deep electrification. Overbuilding now means that we will have the infrastructure that would enable deep electrification, that will enable much faster integration of renewables. And of course, when I say overbuild, I also refer to wind and solar, not just to the grid. Overbuild means that today we are talking about offshore, but offshore, you know well, has always a dry side to it. So whatever we do offshore has an impact on onshore, unless we want to move all our economies at sea, which I don't think is very practical, and we won't do it in time. So reinforcing the grid on land is essential. And this is not happening as fast as it should. It did not happen in the past. And what is currently on the table, it's very dangerous. That brings me to point 2, space. We need the space to do all of it. But you are not the only one who needs space. We need space for everything else. All the economic activities need space. People need space. Nature needs space. So we need to understand that a very strong movement to support spatial planning at continental scale is needed. And spatial planning implies that all the users have to be represented in this spatial planning, including nature. There is a restoration law currently under discussion. Tomorrow in the European Parliament, the Conservative section of the Parliament is having a meeting, 3 o'clock, I think, to basically kill the restoration law. If you want to build all you need to build, well, my advice to you is embrace the restoration law and enable restoration targets and nature protection to happen, contribute to them, because there are synergies between energy and nature, and we can protect nature, and the restoration law becomes a tool to do that. So the energy sector, I would say the renewable energy sector and the grid sector has a huge opportunity to actually profile itself for sustainability for the future by aligning objectives together with the environmental and climate community. But what is happening, it is actually the opposite. You are targeting the environmental and climate movement because you think that they are delaying you. But the reality is that the public opposition will increase and the others will win, and you stay home. And then, well, we will get exactly what we don't want. Ingredient number 3, already mentioned, basically do it together. We need a kind of bundling process. I'm not against the unbundling. I think the unbundling was very good. But now planning for a system that is largely based on wind and solar require much stronger collaboration. It's not only in the planning and in the implementation, but also in the narratives. Because, and this is point number 4, the last point of my recipe, people need to have the confidence that we can actually deliver the solutions for this energy transition. So building joint narratives, joint messages, joint solutions, it's important. Because if you don't do it, you are basically giving a competitive advantages of the second best options, the ones we don't want. So my last bit is, what is the role of ENTSO-E for the next decade? I still believe that ENTSO-E needs to maintain its technical expertise. But I would like to see ENTSO-E becoming more visible as a leader, because others are pushing and pulling. And if ENTSO-E does not spell out exactly what is needed, by when and how the sector is going to contribute in enabling a timely offshore deployment and many other things, then you will lose your relevance. Second, all you do, it has to be in the mentality of optimization. Resources are scarce and will continue to become even scarcer in the global context. We cannot waste anything. And so it's not about who earns what, but how do we use the scarce resources in the best possible way, such that European industries, European workers, European space, European nature, European democratic rules can continue. And finally, maybe we should be a bit more imaginative and think about new approaches and solutions. To your last point on congestions, revenue, maybe some new insurance products could fix the problem. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Antonella, for giving some inspiration, for sharing your recipe. You're of course always at liberty to change the slogan of Antje and Gerald about space, time, and sectors by adding a component. You cannot change the laws of physics. Maxwell equations still stand with your Bluetooth approach of energy transmission, but that's a different discussion for later on. Okay, we now turn over to an exciting next part of the session, a discussion with all of you physically present here and joining remotely. So it's my pleasure to introduce the two moderators for this Q&A session, Bojana Mijic from TenneT, Senior Advisor on Offshore with TenneT Netherlands, and Bente Haaland, who's Head of Offshore Planning at Statnet, and both of them are also co-convener of our ENTSO-E Offshore Coordination Group. So Bojana, Bente, I pass on for the moderation for this session with our panelists and all attendees here. To you, please.
Happening to the energy sector.
I'll let the moderators trigger this one.
That's the right thing.
I would say, Antonella, good things are happening. Looking at the panelists here, and thank you so much for your presentation. So the event is hybrid, and therefore also the questions in the session will be hybrid, and we will try to find a good balance between the questions from our audience that is physically present here and also from the online audience. But maybe we can start with one question to Antje from my side, because I think that slide of yours on the congestion income was very triggering also for Antonella. And I also saw a little bit of your reaction when Vasiliki was doing her presentation. Would you want to first maybe comment on that? And then we start with one online question, maybe, Bente.
I think that's the middle of discussions where we currently are. So with this transmission access guarantee, and as I said, we're just in the phase of fine tuning. In general, we agree there is a challenge for generators, and this must be compensated somehow. We just discuss the how, and I appreciate your idea with some insurance, something. So of course, from our position, we would not like to give the congestion income to somewhere else because it has been created exactly to remove the congestions. So you said it right. So it should be spent then for removing congestion, also for infrastructure, or to reduce tariffs. And if there is congestion income, there's a reason for it. So then we would break the circle. And we suspect that especially countries maybe in Southern Europe who have already now difficulties in financing infrastructure, they would be have even bigger problems, and they would need to take credits which are expensive. And of course they could stop building hubs, but then again we would set the offshore targets in danger. So yeah, I think we together look desperately for a solution, how this risk could be addressed, but it's not yet on the table. But that's good stuff for this afternoon, I think. So if there's anyone having a brilliant idea, so let's think about that.
Can I clarify something?
Yes, of course.
Sure. So we are not talking about sharing congestion rents in general, but congestion rents that are the increase of congestion rents because of a wind farm being solely connected to this asset, which reduce market revenues for the wind farms, but increase congestion rents. So we're talking just for a share of the congestion rents to be shared.
But still, it's there's no difference if it's a share of that, or it's the principle which would.
If the congestion rent has been generated because of a wind farm generating on the interconnector, it's very different from the principle of the operation of the interconnector.
No, but you could imagine you have maybe two countries, but a third one is causing the congestion, which then
we're talking about the, as I mentioned, the limitations due to system operation reasons, right?
Yeah.
So for a specific case.
But it's not, the congestion is not caused by the wind generator, but might be caused somewhere else in the system. But who should then pay for that? Also, we need to do some very thorough thinking, and it's about the general principle which should not be approached. I see Bente getting nervous.
I see there is a question also online according to this congestion rent, congestion revenue created by hubs of offshore wind farms. This must not be shared between TSOs and wind investors. This would be a subsidy for offshore wind, which is not given to competing renewables. Hence, this would distort competition. Do you have any comments to this?
Yes, of course. As I explained before, there is a specificity on for offshore wind farms connected to a hybrid net connector and bidding in offshore bidding zone. They are unfavorized compared to any onshore generation and radially connected offshore wind farms, exactly for the technical reason that I described before. So it's actually the opposite. They are not compensating for something that the other assets do not have as a problem. So it's not.
Antonella, and in the meantime, do we have a question from our audience here? Please raise your hand. If not, we continue. Okay.
Well, this is because offshore is a new actor in the market, and therefore new tools have to be developed. The hybrid connection is a new element in the market, and therefore new tools have to be developed. But this is a temporary problem. And I think that whenever we discuss about these topics, we need to have a time frame in mind, because very often we talk about a temporary problem as if it is a long-lasting issue. But that's not the case. A temporary problem requires probably a temporary solution, but the overall market structure has to be rethought in terms of whether it is suitable or not, and I don't have a clear answer to that. So it's a question to a system that is largely wind and solar, including offshore. But that's a temporary problem.
Indeed, but to have the first investments, we need temporary solutions. So this is exactly.
Yeah, but then
things will be perfect one day. We will be in an ideal world, but until then, some things need to happen.
But maybe not that way forward. But I think let's discuss in the afternoon if there's maybe a third or fifth option to solve that. So we acknowledge the issue, There's no doubt about that. But we also acknowledge that also we have increasing issues which we must take care that they are solved. And just we cannot give money away where people might think, well, you earn now more, but we also build more, we invest more. We have so huge investments and also need to take care that these investments are paid back, and that we invest in the future grid so that it's robust for the future. And yeah,
and maybe it's worth reminding that these revenues are regulated, and that means it's not the profitability of the TSOs that is going to be shared by the owners in the regulated business. So it is a completely different discussion. No.
And then maybe one question to Vasiliki, because I think on your slide you were talking about all of these requirements and decisions that are made more on a national level, and that for this hybrid solutions now we have a problem. We also have lack of time to make certain decisions and to go to this process that was established for normal connection codes or requirements. Do you have some kind of a suggestion or a solution how to speed up that process, how to be more effective, and to find not a silver bullet like Antonella mentioned, but a silver lining in all of these differences so that we actually grow from differences and learn from them?
Do you mean in terms of the network development plans or for specific requirements?
Specific requirements for connection, and let's say the network codes, they define ranges and then on a national level you specify what is the best for your country. But now if you want to connect to two countries, and this is also down the line of this first question, Wind Europe considers hybrids as an opportunity to increase optimization of the grid, and ENTSO-E defines them as connecting two countries plus a wind farm. Do we need to connect the hybrids, mesh grid, for most optimal solution? Is this an ISO task? So now if we want to have some kind of alignment, that would be like looking this from more integrated perspective, looking this as one system, like Antje said in her presentation.
Okay, so first of all, this is a very difficult question to answer like that. It requires years of simulation and collaboration by different stakeholders. So I cannot really say now what would be the best for the topology of the system. But regarding the network codes, the technical requirements that you mentioned at the beginning, in parallel with the market design revision, there is also a big revision of the grid connection codes. With many stakeholders being involved in the discussions and bilateral discussions and public consultations. So first of all, this is a very good context to resolve all these issues, but a problem that usually comes as an answer to that blocks some of the discussions is that the network codes usually stay at a high level of descriptions of requirements, while then of course every country has flexibility on how to implement them, which is normal. There are specificities in every country, so it's normal to have this approach. But I think we could together reinforce a kind of guidance on how these things should be implemented at national level, which should also be somehow to some degree binding. So not just only as a guidance. So what we have today with implementation guidance documents, this is too light for member states to follow, for TSOs to follow. So we need somehow with our collaboration to reinforce this European level recommendations.
And Antonella, this goes with your recipe for a very delicious solution, and to have ENTSO-E define its role and keep the technical expertise. So I think we need to go into a little bit more details to let's say.
So definitely, but we are not naming the elephant in the room, which is energy policies are nationally defined. So whatever comes from the European context, it has to be implemented. And what you are asking, Vasily, is a kind of a much stronger European influence. So I doubt that ENTSO-E is the actor that can deliver European energy policy, because this is a political process. But of course, ENTSO-E can do much more in bringing clarity on the advantages of having stronger standardization in implementation. Yeah, I think
That's actually why we wrote also this paper 6, because we know that many countries are just starting the offshore wind adventure and are looking for how to do the setup. And the only thing we can do is to show what happens or what are the implications of a different delivery model. So related to who has which role in this game or in the phase between network planning to operations. And so this was what we did with this 6th paper to show the implications. And maybe you remember there was not one model having only green spots. Nothing is perfect, but you could see a tendency. And I invite you again, also coming from different countries, have a look into this and take this home with you and maybe discuss with your national governments if there are discussions on how the setup could be in your country and who is responsible for what, including how the offshore generators should be responsible. Should they connect only to the next hub, or should they even be responsible to connect onshore? This makes a difference. And you find some inspiration in that paper related to what could be best for your country. And the more we are aligned across countries, the easier it is to go fast. And this is what we need to do now. We need to go fast.
Antonella, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I would like to know whether the wind industry has been consulted in these different models or not. But also, I would like to add that a lot of countries that are now starting with offshore wind, governments are desperate for input. And so if the grid side and the wind developer side go jointly with clear messages and clear processes, I think that this is the best way to really accelerate offshore deployment. And that's why I come back to what I said before. You need to align, but not only behind closed doors in public narratives.
But then I think that is a perfect role for ENTSO-E to act as a facilitator for all of these alignments and come to some of the joint solutions that are taking into account input from all of these different stakeholders.
Well, it depends, because ENTSO-E can definitely take a leadership role in this. And you really have to make sure that you understand and consider the input of the different stakeholders. And I doubt that this is sufficiently done at this point in time. And so, yeah, it's a work in progress, I would say. There has been a huge improvement. I want to spell this out, but we are not yet there. And we are not yet there simply because we don't have the experience. This offshore deployment has never been done before. So a lot of the answers we simply don't know, but the questions have to be formulated jointly. Because if you don't do that, you will get wrong answers because you ask the wrong questions.
Yes, and I think it is really good that we have these events where we can actually discuss about this, identify gaps, and try to find a way forward that will deliver the best possible solution. There was a mentioning of standardization, and I see, Bente, there is one question
Yes.
asking something in that direction. Would you like to?
Yes, absolutely. And Antonella, I would like to ask the question for you. And you were talking about optimization, and you were talking about building for the future. And we are talking about standardization, and I see that it's a very, very relevant question on that. There are many aspects to be considered when planning a sustainable future-proof offshore system. What role does standardization play? Which arguments should be emphasized in the ongoing standardization work? And I think that is a very good question, because it's easy to agree that we should standardize everything. It should be interoperable, and we should build a meshed system. That is one view that is very easy to understand. On the other side, if you look at all the materials, the weight, the big footprint that you create when building these big structures, it's important that we're not building a new problem or challenge for the future. So what are the considerations, like from a sustainability point of view? Is it like one standard fits all, and we should emphasize on building for the future the same standard, or should we consider to be more like taking nature sustainability into account and be more like sophisticated is not a good word, but like to make more decisions from time to time and place to place, to consider what is the best for the future.
So I think you are mixing two different concepts. Let's start with the standardization one. I think technological standardization has some advantages. We need to be careful not to kill innovation, but what you want, if you want to be fast, you want an off-the-shelf system. You don't want your grid supplier to manufacture for you every time a specific piece of cable according to your unique specification. Sorry, this takes time, and this is not fitting with the speed that we want to achieve. Standardization in design in the offshore with hybrid solution and so on, it is an ongoing process, and there will be a lot innovation coming up. And of course, we want to deploy solutions as fast as possible. And so standardizing processes can indeed help in faster deployment. But this doesn't have anything to do with the environmental impacts that this standardization may bring. In whatever technological innovation mood you are, you need to run a life cycle analysis to understand what is the entire impact of your choices. And then you need to do an environmental impact assessment of where this infrastructure is going to be deployed. Because when you have design a fantastic piece of whatever, and you deploy it here, you cannot assume that you can deploy it exactly in the same way elsewhere. But it's not because the technology needs to be adapted, but your mitigation and compensation strategies have to be adapted because the environment changes. And so you need a much more horizontal approach to technology deployment, infrastructure deployment, where the living environment or the nature environment and the societal environment becomes equally relevant to your technological priorities. It's basically deploying technologies in nature and next to someone. And the idea that with offshore, you have no public opposition, well, you have it because there are other uses of the sea. And I just want to mention fisheries that everyone has heard of. And they continue to ask for a moratorium for subsea cable and offshore wind on the ground of environmental impacts. And we did have the Brexit because of fishing, the fishing industry. So they're very powerful.
Thank you, Antonella. I support and completely agree. So standardization and innovation is not in conflict with sustainability. It is how we deploy this innovative technologies. Looking at the time, how much time we still have? One question. Okay, so maybe this question we can ask. Now each TSO develops the plan in each country, which jointly forms the entire plan in EU. Why not EU develops plans on certain areas and initiates the public bidding to attract third-party investments?
That's easy to answer because it's exactly the other way around. So we do we do produce a joint offshore network development plan. So Francesco and me will discuss this afternoon, I think in the next session actually. And we do also the same onshore. That's the famous 10-year network development plan, of which the ONDP is part of. Yeah, and then it's up to each investor to look at these plans and to find inspiration and to see the opportunities and to think about projects. So it's exactly the way it is wished in that question.
Thank you, ladies, for first very informative and well-structured presentations, and also for this Q&A session. And I think now we will have a coffee break. So we will continue after with the, let's say, second session of the morning. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll start now for our second session of today's workshop on offshore electricity infrastructure. I'm confident you enjoyed a good first session already. I really hope you also enjoyed a good discussion over the break here at least. So as said at the beginning, let's look into the eventual planning of infrastructure needed offshore and how to actually enable it. We covered a lot of good topics already in session one. For this one, we really talk about the core of ENTSO-E's work as well, and many stakeholders involved, how to actually develop offshore electricity infrastructure. So very happy to have with me here for this panel the European Commission and colleagues from ENTSO-E. You had a sneak preview for lunch during the coffee break, and I will give a sneak preview for TONEP 2024 and the offshore network development plans being developed as we speak, ready for publication early next year. More to come on that in this session. To kick off this second session, it's my pleasure to introduce to all of you Mr. Joachim Balke, who is Head of Unit at the European Commission on Infrastructure and, I must be complete, also regional cooperation. So Joachim, many thanks for sharing with us your views about thoughts from the Commission about what do ONDPs mean, what does the 10-year regulation actually mean going into force now, and anything else you would like to give as recommendations to ENTSO-E and other stakeholders here present. Joachim, the floor is yours. Please.
Great. Thanks very much. Thanks, Edwin. Thanks to ENTSO-E for the invitation, and very happy to be here to say a couple of introductory words before you hear the core of this session, which is about the ongoing work on the ONDPs. And I would just like to start off by saying that I think this is actually a really, really exciting exercise. From the side of the Commission, I can say that the idea that we should do offshore planning in a somehow more holistic manner, offshore infrastructure planning, is not a new one. I think it's an idea that we've had for quite a while, and I think these ONDPs are, in my view, the core of what I think is going to be a new approach to developing offshore renewables. And in my personal view, it's also the most exciting element in the new 10-year regulation that we have to implement. So I'm actually really looking forward to this new concept to take shape. If we go to the next slide, a few words by way of introduction. Now, as you have all been able to witness over the last month, there has been quite, I would say, a series of summits on offshore. Attended really at the highest political level, focused on the North Sea, but also covering the Baltic Sea. Now, I think this is in itself important because what it shows is not only that developing offshore has reached the highest political level in quite a few member states, but also that I think what heads of states and government have come to understood is that achieving our objectives in offshore requires a cooperative approach and an approach based on regional cooperation. I mean, you mentioned it in the introduction, Edwin, and I think this is I can't emphasize enough how important that is, because as we will see, I mean, when we look at your plans and hopefully from the few slides I've prepared, developing integrated offshore infrastructure is quite a complex exercise. And I think it's completely impossible to do without political support for cooperation at the highest level. Now, as you all know, the level of commitments, non-binding commitments for offshore renewables that have been agreed upon in all the sea basins in Europe. So I don't have to go through the numbers again, but as I think we are all aware in this room, these objectives are extremely ambitious already in 2030, but of course then even more so as we go to 2040 and 2050. This being said, while they're ambitious, I think they're also necessary to these offshore ambitions if we want to actually achieve our renewables targets. And these renewables targets, they're mandatory. The offshore ambitions, of course, are not. But I mean, the renewables target that we have agreed on quite recently of 42.5%, at least, with a possible top-up, is also extremely ambitious, and this is mandatory. And I don't think it can be reached if we fail on offshore. So in that sense, these things are linked. If we go to the next slide, clearly, and this is one of the reasons why cooperation is necessary, one of the biggest challenges, again, you're all aware, is space in the North Sea in particular. As you see here, we are going to run into what some people call a squeeze for space. Because the offshore wind farms and of course also the infrastructure for 100 gigawatts in a couple of years will take already an enormous amount of space in an area which is not virgin as we speak. This is why we have maritime spatial planning. Now we have a framework in place which obliges member states to have national plans. The vast majority has such plans. That is a useful tool. But I think where we have to continue working is on the one hand, on bringing these maritime spatial plans into line with the energy objectives as provided in the NECPs, in the National Energy and Climate Plans. This is not yet the case in all member states. And of course, these NECPs are also being upgraded to the new targets. So this has to happen on a national level. But then the other element where I think we need to go further than where we are today is in, again, the regional cooperation of member states on maritime spatial planning. Now, only 2 weeks ago, the new initiative was launched in Paris, actually on the initiative of the Dutch and the French, the so-called Greater North Seas initiative. And the idea here is very much to bring together on a regional level ministries from the different users, let's say, of the sea. So not only energy, but also fisheries and the maritime people, basically. So also the environmental people, nature protection. And I think one of the questions which was raised is whether it will also take something like an integrated plan, basically, for the sea basin, which brings together the different uses of the sea basin, because this we don't have today, at least not in the North Sea. So just important to keep in mind that the scramble for offshore space is going to intensify. If we go to the next slide, and I think this is one of the I think 2 core reasons why we need integrated projects. So hybrid projects, we tend to call them. I mean, they have different forms, but I think quite clearly we will not be able to reach our offshore objectives without such integrated projects. So purely on the basis of radials. And this is basically because of space and the environmental impact, and it's because of costs and the supply chain. I think these are the 2 key reasons why we cannot do without the efficiencies of such integrated and hybrid projects. Now, when we adopted the new, or when we negotiated the new 10E regulation, offshore was clearly at the heart of what we were thinking about. And this idea of, let's say, enshrining in the legislation a more coherent planning for the sea basins. Now, the first part of this is that in the new 10E regulation, we have the specific offshore corridors, the regional groups, 5 altogether. And also we have now a wider scope of this new 10E. We have explicitly included hybrid projects, and we also have radial projects included. So we are now at an advanced stage of the first PCI process of this new 10E regulation. We will have a meeting actually at the end of this week. Probably some of you will be there if you're project promoters, where we will discuss basically the preliminary outcome for those of the assessment for those offshore projects and others who applied to become PCIs or PMIs, as it were, on this first PCI list under the new 10E. And this status of PCI, of course, is quite important for the projects as such. But if we go to the next slide, I think the more, let's say, fundamental novelty is indeed that we have enshrined in the 10E the idea of having offshore network development plans, which add, in a sense, the top-down vision for the sea basins, while, of course, sort of continuing with the process that we know under the TYNDP, and these ONDPs are also part of the TYNDP, as you will explain. But I think it's important to stress that there will be a combination of a more top-down vision with, of course, the individual project-by-project assessment, which will of course happen and which will decide whether projects end up on the list. Now, I won't go into this in detail because that's the main part of this session. So I will perhaps directly go to the next slide. Just to put it into context and to explain in a few words that the, let's say, the process that we have envisaged in the 10E doesn't end with the ONDPs. They are a cornerstone, but actually it goes on from there. Because if I said in the beginning that doing integrated offshore projects is complex, I think there are technical complexities, but probably a key complexity is a political one, which is linked to the question of distribution of costs and benefits. So that is certainly one of the key elements which needs to be tackled. It's complex for hybrid projects because they involve a generation side and a transmission side, and these have to be brought together. And this is to a certain extent the purpose of the next step in the envisaged process, which is, first of all, for us as Commission to come up with a guidance on cost benefit and cost sharing on a sea basin level. This is then this goes then back to ENTSO-E. ENTSO-E should basically apply this to the ONDPs and see what it would mean for the member states. And on the basis of that, then it's an iterative process. It will be brought back to member states who will then have the possibility to revise their offshore plans in the lights of this, let's say, preliminary cost sharing proposal. So, I mean, these parts of the process, as you can see, they will drag on into 24 and 25. So we are at still a bit more preliminary stage. That's why it's too early to go into the content of it. But I think it's important to be kept in mind that the process will continue. If we go to the next slide, and yeah, I mean, I'll be short because presumably the 10 minutes are almost over. I did want to say a few words just also on the market side of it. Of course, here we focus on the network side, but obviously, if we talk about hybrid projects, this also has a generation side. And the question of how do we actually incentivize the offshore renewables developers to go for hybrid projects is one which I think we've also been discussing for a long time. Now, in brief, we do think that the internal market rules are appropriate, and there shouldn't be a sort of separate set of rules for offshore. This being said, one core question has always been the question of the bidding zone configuration. I think here already some time ago when we published our initial offshore strategy, we came out relatively clearly in saying that we do think, given the upscale envisaged, the offshore bidding zone concept is probably the most future-oriented one. And I think that's what we continue to recommend. It's not enshrined as a mandatory solution in legislation, but we do think this is the solution which will allow the upscaling of such hybrid projects while basically respecting our internal market rules, also with a view to congestion management. Since this implies certain risks, let's say for the offshore development for the offshore developers, there are two elements to be kept in mind. One is the volume risk. This we have proposed to address with the so-called transmission access guarantee, currently under negotiation in the internal energy market legislation. And then there is the price risk, because under certain conditions, in particular, as long as we don't have an integrated offshore grid, the price might be reduced. And this is probably where we need things like contracts for difference. And we've also made some recommendations and some legal proposals, in fact, how to structure these contracts for difference in the best possible way. One last point, which is linked to the what you see here under the term of non-price criteria. Clearly, one big challenge, both for the grid developers, but also for the offshore renewables developers, is the supply chain, right? So I think the offshore development plans, one of their functions is actually going to be to signal, what is the infrastructure, what is the volume that we plan to roll out to enable our European supply chain to ramp up, because I think, as we all agree today, is not yet up to scale. So I think that's a core function of these offshore network development plans. But we have also, let's say, proposed how to address this objective to upscale our our European supply chain through for example, the contract for difference support mechanisms in the form of these so-called non-price criteria in the Net Zero Industry Act. So it's a little aside perhaps, but an important one, because I think the supply chain constraints will be super important. Now, I'm sure I spoke for more than 10 minutes, and I can wrap up. Last slide. Yeah, we skipped this one. As you all know, there are possibilities to ask for European finance, but this I don't have to repeat. Usually everybody's well aware of these options. So feel free to apply once you're on the PCI list. I think in conclusion, as I said, the offshore ambitions require cooperation. I think it's not a can, I think it's a must. And hybrid projects because of the squeeze for space. The ONDPs certainly have a very, very central role in facilitating such cooperation and indicating, for example, where such hybrid projects will make sense. And the next step is then indeed to try and find some guidance on cost sharing. With these elements, plus those which are currently under negotiation in the internal market framework, we hope that we will have a relatively clear and stable set of rules which will allow the investments to go forward, because that's what we need. Thanks very much.
Many thanks, Joachim, for setting the scene, for explaining again which initiatives are ongoing, either voluntarily or triggered by the TNE. Thanks also for that magical statement at the beginning that the ONDPs are the most exciting parts of the new TNE. There's a room of witnesses here. This can never be taken back. So we have our quote for page 1 for the report already. It's a personal statement. Nevertheless, many thanks for sharing your enthusiasm on this one. Before we dive into the TONDP 2024 and the ONDPs, because you covered a broad set of topics already, Joachim, I just want to already perhaps make a small pause for anyone who would like to ask a question to Joachim and anything he presented so far. Really appreciate that you take the time to be available here. I know you're very busy in your schedule with the Copenhagen Forum of next week, of course. So any immediate question for anything Joachim just shared with us, feel free to take the floor already. Yes? Diederik, please. I think there's a microphone which can be shared. Thanks, Emil.
Thank you. Diederik Perenboom, T&D Europe, the grid technology providers. Just a very quick and maybe a little bit of a internal bureaucratic question, but important nevertheless. You talked about marine spatial planning of not just energy, but various sectors. Where is that coordinated in the Commission? Is that with DG Energy? Is it with DG Mare? How do we do it? DG Mare is coordinating. Thank you.
Thank you, Dirk. Any second question? If not, then think about it. Also, for the people joining online, feel free to share your questions and thoughts still via the Slido web. And we'll definitely come back to a Q&A session in a moment still. Good, then we dive into the TONEP 2024 as a segue towards the ONEPs themselves. I'm happy to pass on the floor to Rodrigo Barbosa, who is the manager of the long-term planning team here at ENTSO-E, to share some thoughts about where TONEP 24 is heading towards. Rodrigo, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So we can just have a very brief view on what is the TONEP, why we do the TONEP, and where does the ONDP fit into the picture. So the TONEP is the 10-year network development plan. It's Europe coming together and looking at the development of the network with the significant uptake of renewables, and especially in the offshore that is expected in the coming years. We have to be even more forward-looking. So 10 years is not sufficient anymore. So maybe we should call it a 20-year network development plan. And by the way, it's still a TONEP. And why we do it? So at the end of the day, we want to build infrastructure that makes sense. We want to build infrastructure that enables the energy transition, that improves market integration, and that delivers all the European objectives. To get there, there's quite a few steps that need to be taken. So one of the first steps is defining the scenarios under which all our assessments are made. So we look into the future, what are our objectives, and then we develop scenarios on how can we deliver these objectives in different possible ways. Then from the scenarios, we do a needs exercise, which basically we explore where could make sense to invest, in which borders, in which places in Europe, and to see, let's say, to give an indication for the overall market of where it could make sense to make different investments. That hopefully feeds into all the different investors, project promoters, give them ideas on where are the best places to invest. And that leads to an actual project being developed. We do the collection of these projects, and then we do all the assessments, including a cost-benefit analysis, which gives a good indication of whether the project is worth or not worth under many different indicators. And we have the collaboration with the European Commission on the PCI process, in which the TONEP is one of the key elements leading into the PCI process. Where does the ONDP fit in all of this? So the ONDP functions similarly to a needs exercise. So we're essentially exploring in the offshore what could make sense. What are possible ways of integrating these offshore capacities that are to come in the future? Some of them are already projects. Some of them are more targets and ambitions, and we want to get there, but things are not very well defined yet from the private sector. So we do see it as a needs exercise where we explore the possibilities, we explore how things could be done, and we want to give this message then out to all the investors, project promoters, on what could make sense and go hand in hand with the development over the cycles in the TONEP. Then you move to the next, please. So what is the scope of the ONDP, and especially this ONDP, which is the first implementation of the ONDP together with the TONEP? So the message that we want to get out is we're going to give an overview of the offshore RES capacity the clusters, where they are located, those clusters, not project by project, but really on a cluster level. What are the possible configuration of the transmission infrastructure to integrate these clusters? And then going a little bit more in detail in the report, giving a high-level overview of what could be connections made by pure interconnectors, hybrid projects, radio connections, and also potential reinforcements that could be needed. And if time allows, we will hopefully have a look into the hydrogen part as well, even though the focus, especially for this first ONDP, is really on the electricity side. And that's essentially it. That's where the ONDP fits in the overall ONDP. For future cycles, the integration will be even better done. And yeah, it's going to be an integral part of the TONDP, giving a look into the next 10, 20, and even beyond years in Europe. Thank you.
Thanks for sharing those views, Rodrigo. We needed to have a segue of what T1EP and its whole is about. Antje mentioned already at the start of the session, one earlier today. No one does offshore planning just for the sake of offshore planning. It's about the full interconnected system which has to be planned. So it's good to see how the ONDPs themselves fit into the whole T1EP package. Let's dive into the next presentation then, again by Antje. Thanks again for taking up this one together with Francesco, who is our specialist on ONDPs here at the ENTSO-E Secretariat. We will look a bit under the hood of the wagon on what the ONDPs are really about, how they're being developed. No results yet, bit of expectation management here, but at least some views about how the work is being set up and what you can expect in about half a year time. So Antje, Francesco, I pass on to yourself for some further insights on this one. You do it together here from the stand, I assume, as you wish. I'm very sure this must trigger some questions. So again, to anyone joining remotely or people here in the room, to think about questions you want to fire ahead towards Antje and Francesco via the Slido app, or we can take them from the room in a moment as well, of course. So I pass on to you both. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. As long as you don't ask for results, we're happy to answer on everything. Yeah, so big question is, how is it done? Like every process when planning, first collect the data, then do something with it, so do some modeling and then do some post-processing. That's the answer. In detail, of course, there are some elements in each of these steps. So first, we use the figures which have been collected based on the 10E regulation from the member states in January. So we have these figures, you will see them. Then we compare with the data we have already in ENTSO-E and then take, of course, the member state data. We look at the maritime spatial plans when putting the modeling nodes into our models. So translating polygons into somewhere in the sea, not harming everything according to the DG Mare plans. Then we will prepare the model. This has been done, and actually now we're in the phase of first modeling steps. We do some expansion modeling for 2050 and 2040, not for 2030, because in terms of system planning, 2030 is kind of tomorrow afternoon, so things are more or less known what will happen, and we don't expect new projects popping up by 2030 because it's too close to now. And so then we have some iterations internally in ENTSO-E between regional experts and central modeling and adapt the models. And then the post-processing is actually done by the regions because we need always to be close to the member states and the regions and the member states have their corridors in the 10E corridors, and there we can have some discussions on, is everything like we wanted to have? Do we have support from the member states? And this is then done by the regions. Next slide. In short, to be fast, we also had to take some decisions, and we decided we use simply the model of the T1EP 22 because the model is there, we can use it, and we simply put the new member state figures on these models and try to make them run. And this is ongoing now. Of course, some adjustments need to be made because when you change anything in the model, especially generation or demand, then they tend not to converge or something happens. And this is now in the phase of being progressed so that we have a balanced model and minimize curtailment. And so then we look at the input data. Some need to be adjusted, but essentially we use the T1DP 22 for this very first edition. Later on, as you have seen in Rodrigo's presentation, we merged the processes of the ONDP and the T1DP, so the classic 10-year network development plan, and then all will be done in one process. This bar chart is just to indicate that it's good enough to take the scenarios from 2022 as the offshore ambitions we had in this distributed energy scenario, which we are going to use for the ONDP, are aligned with what the member states actually delivered in January. Next slide. According to the 10E regulation, we are required to come back with a high-level plan. So, but what is high level? And so we also use a bit different methodology in expansion the model compared to the classic T1DP. So we use some linear optimization, also giving some linear results, which are maybe not aligned with what you can buy on the market. So this needs then a plausibility check so that, you have the example, left picture is what comes out of the model, maybe 6.4 gigawatts, but then in the plausibility check made by the regions, this will be adjusted to this can only be 6. And this will be 3 lines and not one big cable. And so when we know then it's okay, maybe 3 lines, then we can put a price on it. And this is then information going into this high-level information, which we will present at the end in the reports. Next slide. These are the figures delivered by the member states, and you can easily see that this is an old slide because yesterday I adjusted something. We have the 5 corridors: North Sea offshore grid, Baltic energy market implementation, Atlantic offshore grid, Southwest offshore grid, and Southeast offshore grid. So we had original a map where you could see, but I think you know the European map and know where North Sea and Baltic Sea and everything else is located. And you see that we have most in the northern seas. What you could also might remind from Vasiliki's presentation this morning, there's huge ambitions from the countries in the northern seas. And especially there, we expect something on hydrogen as well, at least in 2050. Not to forget the figures you see in the bar chart to the right. We have still to add the British and the Norwegian figures here because they had not been part of this member state collection. But of course, these countries also built huge amounts of offshore wind, and we have to add it to the 354 for Europe. Next slide. As an outcome of the last Copenhagen Forum, we had the task together with the Commission to develop this paper. So what we need is not only the capacities from the regions, from the member state, but also where it is, because this is decisive for defining the cable length or finding the cable length. And therefore we developed this paper, which you can find online, what else we need from the member states. And this has also been delivered in January or a bit later. And again, maritime spatial plans are here important because we need to know where we may go or we must not go at all. And therefore, again, regional collaboration in the corridors is important because also these rules are not the same in each country. So what you are allowed to in one EEZ, economic exclusive zone, is not necessarily allowed in the neighboring exclusive economic zones, making things a bit more complicated. But there we have the direct link to the governments. Next. I think now it's you, Francesco. He's much more entertaining than me, so look forward
Thanks,
to the next part.
Thank you very much. So we are going to look what does it mean step by step in terms of developing the plans themselves into, let's say, after having seen the framework and let's say the fundamental choices that we made. So as you remember, there are three steps, main steps in developing the plans. And step one is definitely the data gathering. Data gathering meaning that we start from the information that our members have at national level, because the targets that we receive are of course aggregated, but what does it mean in terms of distribution along the different territories? This is why we set up this bottom-up process, starting from the pan-European market modeling database, and then putting all together at sea basin level so that we can have an easy tool to understand the different capacities in the different maritime areas. Of course, this will be done, there will be then be the base for the model run for 2040 and 2050, and for the draft of the 2030 plans that will be done in the step 3. Next slide. So an important part of the step 1, once we have gathered the data, is of course the MSP. We already learned during the first session today the importance of making a good use of the space available. And this is why the maritime spatial planning already in the step 1, already in setting up the plan, plays such an important part. Because especially for the North Sea, and the Baltic Sea, we have specific information about the space allocated to the generation. And our members use that in order to make sure that when we place the modeling nodes, this is done in compliance with the plans developed by the different governments. You can see here a very good example of the Netherlands nodes. There have been developed dedicated methodologies to do that, to interpolate the geographical coordinates in order to make sure that when we include something in the model and we calculate the distances there, this is done, of course, taking into account the planned position for the generation. Next slide, please. So what is the infrastructure that is relevant? We have had a quick look looking at the scope of the ONDP. Of course, the traditional interconnectors connecting two onshore nodes, the radial connections without, let's say, for which is not foreseen any expansion, connect to the onshore market nodes. The radial connections for which it is foreseen a potential expansion to a hybrid configuration connected to a dedicated offshore market node, hybrid project for which no expansion is foreseen, model with their own market nodes, and last but not least, hybrid with potential for expansion. And this is probably the most futuristic, let's say, configuration, because we already see here the potential for meshed grid in the European basins. Next slide. So what happens then when we model it? Now, starting from the 2040 offshore transmission infrastructure, meaning what it is planned, the project that are in the pipeline, the 2040 member state targets that we have seen, and the 2040 scenario results, we are able to set up the starting model for the first modeling run that will end up giving us the results of how our offshore system might look like in 2040, in, let's say, in an aggregated way, meaning aggregated that we put together transmission capacity connecting the different generation nodes. It is important to say that we expand transmission, not generation. So for us, the member state target are a starting point. We do not, the plans do not expand on top of it. This is, of course, related to the fact that the plans must be in line with the targets declared by the government. But what we definitely do is looking on how to optimally connect all these nodes. So the possible results are either individuation of new transmission capacity connecting the nodes, or let's say reinforcement of existing transmission capacity connecting the nodes to neighboring offshore nodes or to onshore market areas. Next slide. The 2040 results will then be the base for the 2050 modeling run. This will allow us to understand how the transformation, how the evolution of the offshore system will happen from one time frame to the other. This is why the ONDP 2040 results will then feed into the 2050 starting grid composed by the 2050 offshore transmission infrastructure, the member states target, and the scenario results, in order to understand what comes on top of the model what comes on top of the results obtained for the 2040 model. And again, here is the same, either confirmation of what we got in the 2040 modeling run, or further expansion to further optimize the system in light of the increased generation capacities to be foreseen. Next slide. So in step 3, though, we will have to assess these results, because the sizing that we will obtain will be composed of, let's say, continuous values that not always, as Antje mentioned, are, let's say, manageable in terms of technical requirements. So our TSO experts will then look at these results in order to arrive at, let's say, sizing these transmission corridors in compliance to the foreseen technical capabilities of transmission systems, looking at size of the converters, technical capabilities of cables, etc. Next slide. Here comes the again the MSP. So we take it into account at the beginning for the generation, and then again when post-processing the results to assess the potential path, of course, aggregated path for the transmission infrastructure. Since the MSP already delivered valuable information on protected areas, conflicts with other sectors, shipping lanes, military areas. So what we will do is to try to understand how the individuated corridors fit into the current spatial planning, highlighting possible conflicts, avoiding them, of course, whenever it's possible, optimizing the distances, and in general, giving clarity to the promoters the moment they will have to produce, let's say, design-specific information. Next slide. So about the contents of the reports, I passed again the word to Antje.
Test, yes. What you can expect is a bunch of maps, is a bunch of statistical information. So there's an example of a map. We have seen better maps today, but just to mention again, this is a non-binding high-level exercise based on non-binding targets. So it's not dangerous, but it's giving valuable information to the markets. We will not question any existing plans or for projects, but we think, okay, it will be there. That's the starting condition. And then, yeah, we will come back with statistics, tables, graphics, indicating how much assets will be needed, so that the industry knows, okay, I have to build 3 cable fabrics, manufacturing stations in Europe, or even more, or DC breakers are needed, whatever, so that they can see the amount and feel motivated. Yes, we built some new supply assets, and that the member states can start to negotiate with each other. Well, I see you have still space in your area and we miss something, so then they can start to negotiate to reallocate maybe something. And again, it's a part of the TUNDP. This is an iterated exercise. Every 2 years, we will get new member state figures. We will get new plans with this high-level information. Beside this ONDPs for each sea basin, we are going to publish a report on European basis. We are going to publish stakeholder involvement assets. We are going to publish, of course, the methodology. So everything you have heard today, you can read then. And we will publish a survey asking you if you see anything which we could improve already in the next step. And the next step is has already started, as the classic TUNDP is ongoing, and we'll implement the findings of the offshore plans into the classic plan, so that you already in the course of the TUNDP 24 hopefully can see a bit of a merged product. From 2026, everything should be quite aligned. Thank you. I think this was it. No, not really. the process, but kind of you have seen this in the waves. Now we're in the modeling phase. Then we'll have the iterations with the regions, so the ENTSO-E regions who do the refinement and post processing. In autumn, in summer and early autumn, we will write the reports, and then we will have to go to internal consultation phases, and then do the fine tuning and publish 24th of January next year. Now I'm ready. Thank you.
Many thanks, Antje. Many thanks, Francesco, for an excellent overview of the work already ongoing since quite a while, and the work still to be done by January next year, when we plan to launch the ONDPs for the 5 sea basins across Europe. We're a bit ahead of behind schedule, but still we do need to take some time, of course, for any questions anyone here with us in Brussels might have, or questions from people on the audience. I see already a raised hand. Kro, I'm just going to pass the floor to you. Thanks for raising an observation, a comment, a question you have with the panel here.
Yeah, it's a question. It's regarding the impact on the onshore grid. How do you incorporate this in the ONDPs?
So in the first edition, we focus on the offshore part, knowing that the onshore part is being assessed in the classic IOSN, as Rodrigo showed in the very beginning. And so we will take the outcome of the offshore part, plug it into the ongoing T1EP 24 exercise, so that the onshore part can be evaluated in the routines of the T1EP 24 exercise. Some details are still to be clarified. We have some headaches here and there, but as always, we will solve it somehow. And then when we have to do this financial exercise, everything is on the table. So then we have the full picture. I interrupted you, sorry.
In addition, we chose to work with the T1EP 2022 model, looking at, let's say, the similar figures related to offshore wind, because of course the DE model takes into account the expansion of offshore wind. So we were confident about the fact that the NTCs between the nodes in the distributed energy were already taking into account a similar amount of offshore integrated into the grid. In terms of granular assessment, this is what we want to find out in the IOSN. And that's why Antje mentioned that then the results will then feed into the ISN, which is running in a much more granular way for the onshore model, so that we are able to understand more than at simply, let's say, market level, the potential impact between, let's say, on the onshore system. So for this first edition, let's say, due to the timeline, we had to split up a little bit this process in this way. But of course, let's say that the impact on the onshore system is an overall part of the integration of offshore RES.
Super, thanks. I have the difficult task of balancing a bit the questions from the audience and from the people participating remotely. I'll try to balance it as much as possible. Probably will not be able to capture all the questions now in the limited time we have, but at least if people have questions which are raised now, not answered, we'll get back to them later on after this event. So feel free to still raise your questions as needed. I think the first question I saw coming in from the people joining remotely, I think it's a question to Joachim. It's on permitting. The question is, are there any plans to also act on speeding up permitting for offshore wind generation infrastructure, even merged, in addition to processes such already communicated in Repower EU, whatever's in the 10E and so on? So anything else in the pipeline or what people may be missing?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, permitting has been probably the most used word over the last half a year or so, and rightly so. I mean, because I think this is what actually prevents implementation to happen on time. I mean, we have a lot of rules now, the 10E already for a while, but also in the RED III and in the emergency regulations on permitting on the generation side, in particular as regards the so-called go-to areas. And obviously the first priority at this point in time is to implement those. So that's, I think, something that we're trying to do with member states to make sure that they use these options. I think personally, if we look at offshore in particular, I do think that this idea of offshore network development plans is quite important also in the context of having the infrastructure there on time, because I think the only way to do that is to do the famous anticipatory investments and to invest in infrastructure already a little bit before all the wind parks are there, to put it in very simple terms. I think that's the only way to get around the fact that otherwise the permitting procedures will be delaying. And this is why I think the function of the ONDPs is also to allow or to identify these anticipatory investments. And then, of course, we need to continue the dialogue with the regulators that these are allowed. But I think that is also a key tool in avoiding that the infrastructure is there too late, basically, for the offshore wind parks.
Thanks, Joachim. I think I saw a question in the back. Yep, I don't know who was first. Christian, I'll give it. No, sorry, the other colleague, please. Yeah. Please also state your name and affiliation for everyone to know who the question comes from. Thank you. Please.
I have a question. Okay, I'm from Euroelectric. So the question is related to the TYNDP, the connection between TYNDP 2022 and 2024. So now we know that the TYNDP 2024 scenario process is ongoing. And also there is this expert technical advisory group going to be formed, which gives opportunities for the stakeholders to give inputs to the scenario process. And from your presentation, I understand that the ONDP is going to take inputs from the TYNDP 2022 and not 2024. So my question is like, whether is there an opportunity for the ETAG, the expert technical advisory group, to provide inputs to this ONDP process? Because the ETAG is basically giving input to the TYNDP 2024, whereas ONDP is not taking input from the TYNDP 2024, if my understanding is correct. So is there an opportunity in the coming 6 months for this group to provide inputs to the ONDP?
Thank you. I hear a double question. First of all, how input can be given for the ONDPs, and thanks for making some advertisement for the ETAG we're establishing as well. So perhaps for the first question, how to engage on the ONDPs being developed now, I'll pass to Antje and Francesco. And Rodrigo, if you can comment on the ETAG and what it actually means afterwards.
So I thought maybe Rodrigo, you're best placed to see the
Yeah.
picture.
Okay. So looking at the ONDP itself, these events are, let's say, one of the most appropriate places, at least, to bring the visibility, to be able to kickstart a discussion. And we're very happy to take feedback and would welcome the discussion. With regards to the expert group being set on for the scenario building and for the TYNDP 2024, that is indeed really focusing a bit more on the future process. It will still have an impact, let's say, on how the results of the ONDP are taken into consideration in the rest of the TYNDP, in this integration of TYNDP. So ultimately, even from that group, there is a chance to have an impact in the, let's say, in the final product. But in the meantime, we're aiming at bringing the awareness in these events, and we're very happy to engage bilaterally in case more specific discussions are to be held.
Yeah, super. Yeah, do grab the colleagues over lunch for questions about how you can engage further in the coming months. But thanks for the question anyway. I'll switch again back to a question we have from the colleagues joining remotely. I'll let democracy prevail and pick the upvoted question here. It's a double question to the speakers. Firstly, what's the contribution that ONDPs are expected to bring to the European planning processes? I think somehow you already emphasized this, but thanks for re-emphasizing again. But the second one is also a very interesting one. What might be the expected evolution of the ONDP in future editions after this successful first one, of course? So other ideas we have parked for later editions. Interesting to hear what you can share on this one. Perhaps Francesco, if you want to take this one.
So about the first question, the identification of the transmission corridors between the nodes is the for the, let's say, for the offshore, for integrate the offshore generation is the first objective. Also the impact, and also connecting to the second one, because we have basins where offshore nodes are not as relevant as in the northern one. The potential impact of foreseen interconnector projects that are coming up the pipeline. We have this several examples in the Mediterranean. So to give an understanding of this, of the transmission capacity, the potential amount of transmission capacity ending up in the European waters in the different time frames. Because sometimes, especially when it comes to integrating the offshore res, we have such a big amount of targets that we don't have yet these projects in the pipeline to cover it up. So to clarify and to give a signal on potential optimal configuration there will allow promoters to have a clear view on what's the infrastructure that needs to end up there and to make the choices, let's say, accordingly. About the second part is what we already aim at right now is to have even more integrated modeling process. For this first edition, due to the, let's say, timeline imposed by the regulation, we had to find that solution that ensure the delivery next year. But we are already actually discussing right now how this will evolve in terms of granularity, will evolve in terms of sector integration, granularity on and offshore. When I mentioned the IOSN after growth question was exactly about it. There is a point about how to optimally connect offshore system, no matter the configuration. And so the evolution of the models in order to give us also clear signals that go beyond the single, maybe the single, let's say, node per country setup, it's definitely a direction to explore potential evolution. And so in general, to keep the strategic nature of it, but still clarify, to better clarify the points that allow project promoters to make their investment choices.
Thanks for the question. Thanks for the response. Step by step, and more to come. That's what I take from this one. Question from the audience. Christian in the back first.
Thanks, Edwin. Christian Kerr from Current Europe, the Association of Innovative Grid Technologies. The TYNDP had two decarbonization scenarios. I think Antje mentioned them. There was also the national trends. Those decarbonization scenarios were not reflected in the system needs, which meant that the TYNDP was based on national trends rather than the decarbonization scenarios. So my question is, will we see in the TYNDP 24 decarbonization reflected? And I think it relates also to the question that was put up here on the net zero scenario. Is there a mechanism for assuring that the TYNDP 24 is compatible with the political goals of decarbonization and energy independence?
Thanks, Christian. Rodrigo, I pass to you.
Yeah. So in the TYNDP 2024 cycle, the national trend scenario will have a different flavor, in the sense that it will not be, let's say, a simple amalgamation of the NECPs. So it will take in consideration the European binding targets, and the scenario will be compliant. So by the way that the scenario is going to be constructed this time compared to previous times, we are ensuring that the national trends do meet the targets, hence hopefully removing a bit this concern, because the scenarios, they will be compliant, and they are also expected to be compliant by the regulation itself. And we are definitely going in this direction.
Key feature of the next TYNDP cycle for sure. Okay. I switch again back to a question from our participants connecting virtually from Terra Connolly. Perhaps a question I pass on to you, Joachim. The question is, understandably, most focus is today on North Sea and Atlantic. Is there any expectation for the timeline on developing these plans in other seas, Baltic, Mediterranean, Black Sea? I remember also in your presentation, you showed a very nice MSP of the North Seas. You often take the North Seas as an example of what is happening, maybe happening. Anything you can share about the differences inevitably between the various sea basins across Europe and what can be done there? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks a lot. Indeed, very important not to forget that we have sea basins also in other parts of Europe, and it's not only the North Sea. Now, I think one important starting point is that if we look at the non-binding commitments, we do actually have positive non-binding commitments for all sea basins. Obviously, the level is different. That's might be surprising, but they're not zero, far from it, neither in the Mediterranean and in the Atlantic. So in principle, I mean, to answer to the question, the timelines are actually the same in terms of setting up the plans. So I assume we will also have ONDPs for all those sea basins. Now, of course, what's indeed different is the level of development and also concretely the level of projects that have been proposed, for example, for the next PCI list. We do have, as far as I remember, project proposals in all offshore corridors, I think except for one. But if we look at the type of projects, what we see is that, you know, the type of projects we are particularly looking at for the time being, so hybrid projects, cooperation projects, these for the time being, they are indeed concentrated in the North and in the Baltic Sea. In the other sea basins, for the moment, we see more radial projects being proposed. So in that sense, I think the level of, let's say, development is of course not yet the same, but we do think that there are also opportunities for such cooperation projects in other sea basins, notably in the Mediterranean, as we've also identified actually in a couple of preliminary studies that we did already last year. So we do think these have a potential to follow.
Maybe one remark. Actually, the weather is different in Europe. So in Northern Europe, we have not as much sun as in Southern Europe. So in Southern Europe, as ENTSO-E, we always look at the whole production portfolio, and we see a lot more solar projects in the Southern Europe, which is also renewable, and we'll see, and that's also the reason why there's more attention to offshore in Northern Europe compared to other renewables in Southern Europe. So looking at the whole picture, we will have renewable infeed in the infrastructure from both sides, you can say, and then we have to take care that it operates.
Can I just add one last line on this? I think the key thing which will unlock this potential in the other sea basins, except for the Baltic and the North Sea, is the floating technology actually, because you need this because of the geography, and we do actually see the first fully commercial projects coming on for floating offshore wind. So I think once this takes off, I think we can expect a lot from these other sea basins.
Super. Thanks for emphasizing those points again. Yeah. You want to add, Francesco?
Yeah, that we will have one report per basin. So the fact that in the North Sea and the Baltic Sea we expect more generation doesn't mean that the ONDP will focus just on that. The ONDP will be published as a European package looking at all European waters. Of course, there will be differences, but differences is about the technical solutions arriving into the waters. But we will see that, for example, HVDC will have a strong role in the Mediterranean, not by necessarily integrating only RES, but also allowing to, let's say, relieve a little bit of pressure from the onshore system. An example of this is the latest Italian NDP, where we have up to 5 reinforcements made in HVDC. That is something that we ask our members to provide us with information, because it would be really nice to reflect this kind of different solutions impacting the different waters. So North Sea and Baltic Sea will, of course, see more about hybrid configuration and meshed offshore grid, but this does not mean it's it. It's only a part of it, and other solutions will be the focus of the other reports.
Excellent. Thanks. I think due to time, we have to go to our final question. I think so. Liang's hand first, so I'll give her the honor.
Thank you very much, Dr. Liang from ILIA and also K11. And I do have a small question towards Francesco. When we developed the ONDP, I was wondering, a bit curious, how, to what extent and how the GB or the Great Britain are being engaged. Because I do personally see that Britain is a huge player in terms of offshore wind in the North Sea. They almost own half of North Sea, I believe. But with the backdrop of Brexit, I guess it can be a bit tricky. But I'm just curious how they are being engaged. Thank you.
Absolutely. Let's say that in the North Sea, especially you cannot really make any reasonable plan without taking into account the fact that there will be at least probably 100 gigs in 2050 in British waters. ENTSO-E has been in contact with National Grid in order to, let's say, exchange information and gather data in general for the T1DP, because again, ONDP is part of the T1DP, and Great Britain is important not only to develop the North Sea, but in general as a player for the development, in general for the development of the overall energy system. So we are in contact with them. ONDP makes no exception, and we are trying to understand mostly about the distribution of generation, how to optimally model the numbers that might see the light in the English waters. But definitely there will be, let's say, they are being considered when exploring the development of the North Sea, let's say the northern basins, European northern basins.
We collaborate under the frame of this. There's an MOU between European member states and British government from December last year. This is the corridor for Northern Seas offshore grid, and there's an MOU to collaborate. And this we use in the North Sea region from ENTSO-E to have direct contact with them, exchange data, and yeah, they are part of the picture we build. How we communicate this is a different question. So if we could do this is one, or if we always have to separate them, but that's just a question of communication. But definitely they are part of our thinking and collaboration and calculations. Otherwise, it makes no sense, as one margin would be missing.
Yeah. Thanks for emphasizing that. We're coming at the turn of the hour, so I will have to conclude this session at least, but please do contact the colleagues during the lunch break for further discussion today or in the days or weeks to come. You know who to contact now, of course. I pass the floor again to Gerald for some concluding remarks, but first, please join me, of course, in thanking again our panelists, Joachim, Antje, Francesco, and Rodrigo for their participation today. Thank you.
Thank you. Now the only thing between lunch and yourself is me. And if you were wondering if I was playing on my iPhone all the time, no, I was just taking notes, and many notes. No, they all fit on one screen. Okay. When Europe sets the scene, they said, okay, we have 30 gigs of offshore wind. We are going to 450 by 2050 and 1/3 by 2030. I thought the challenge was clear, but then Antonella said, oh yeah, and you have to overbuild. She's always raising the bar a little bit higher. So we have to overbuild not only generation, but also infrastructure. She made it quite clear that we have to plan across time, space, sectors, and communities. So this was added. Thank you, Joachim, for saying that the ONDP has a central role, but you directly put it into perspective, saying, oh, it's just the first start. Then comes the cost-sharing exercise. We are very much looking forward to this. Are we going to meet each other in another conference on this? I suppose so, yeah. Okay. The risk for project developers has been acknowledged. I think that is there, that is known. We discussed it a little bit, and it will be also considered in upcoming regulations. That's an important step. And I will finish with Antonella's quite clear call. She said, cooperate, don't fail. You should debate the solutions, but be aware how the debate is perceived. Make agreements clear, because seeing that we cooperate across sectors, across everyone, it's very important to put certainty in the market. And the more certainty we have, the more it will support the implementation and all our endeavors. Thank you very much. And now it is time for lunch. I think, Edwin, you have a few more organizational items, or we meet at 1400 hours in the different rooms. I think you have the room information for the breakout sessions. Those sessions are going to be physical only. There are no, the virtual part is going to finish. Also, the online audience is not invited into lunch as far as I know.
Our lunch, not our lunch. Thank you, Gerald, for summarizing very well what we all learned before noon. Indeed, at this point, we have to say goodbye to the colleagues joining remotely. Thanks for your interest, and we'll meet at another time, hopefully in person as well, at another event. For everyone here in the room, thank you for joining us for lunch, which you have observed already during the coffee break, which is, I hope, I trust, still outside available for all of you. And we continue with a few roundtable discussions at 2 o'clock indeed. You should all see on your badge which session you're at least registered for to participate in. So session A and D is going to be in room Ampere Volt. To make it less cryptic, it's on this floor, the other side of the floor. People who signed up for session B and C, you meet in room Coulon, which is basically the room again on this floor, the other side of the wall there. So many thanks for your interest. Please do stay with us. Please continue the conversation. At this stage, already many thanks again to all speakers, to all panelists, to all moderators, also to the colleagues who really supported and facilitated this event in the past days and weeks from the back. Many thanks to Leah, Emile, Jose, and everyone from the team here. And have a good break.